My name is Darlene Whitmore. I'm 69 years old. I used to be a teacher, then a full-time mother, then the silent glue holding my family together. And for the past 3 months, I've been a widow. My husband, Ernest, passed away on a Monday morning. It was quiet, the way he wanted it. Just me, his hand in mine, and the faint sound of birds outside the hospice window. We had been married for 41 years. 41 years of routines, shared glances, burnt Sunday pancakes, and the kind of trust that doesn't need words. And yet, exactly 7 days after his funeral, while the sympathy cards were still standing on our mantel, and the roast chicken I made was still warm on the table, I was told I no longer belonged in my own home. Perry, my son-in-law, looked at me across the dinner table like I was part of the silverware. Something outdated, unnecessary. "Now that your husband has died," he said, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "Mourn, pack your bags, and never come back here again." My daughter, Emily, didn't flinch. She just smiled, a soft, polite, practiced smile. The same one she wears when strangers greet her at work. Then came the final line. "The house was never really yours anyway." I didn't speak, not because I didn't have words, but because I had too many. Instead, I stood up, folded the napkin I had placed across my lap so carefully, just an hour earlier, and walked away. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for an explanation. Because deep down, I knew that wasn't the beginning of a misunderstanding. It was the end of an illusion. They had been waiting for Ernest to leave this earth, waiting for me to be alone and outnumbered. I left with only my handbag. My coat still smelled like his cologne, that woody scent he always dabbed behind his neck when we went out to Sunday church. I remember walking past the rose bushes he planted in '89. He called them our anniversary hedge. Now they were blooming, stubbornly, unaware that the house they stood beside was no longer mine. I didn't cry. But the next morning, I went to the bank. That's the part no one expected. They thought I would go to a hotel or a senior center, maybe call one of the women from my book club. They assumed I had no plan, because for decades, I had made everyone else's comfort my plan. They were wrong, because for 41 years, while Ernest provided, I managed. I was the one who kept the receipts, filed the taxes, knew which document belonged in which drawer. They thought they could erase me with a dinner conversation, but they forgot who held the blueprint of this family's finances. So I sat down with Colleen, the same bank manager who opened our first joint account in 1983, and I said, "I need to talk to someone about a property I co-own. There are some developments I wasn't consulted on." Colleen tilted her glasses, gave me the kind of look only women in their 60s can give, that quiet, instinctive understanding, and said, "Of course, Darlene, let's take a look." That was the moment everything changed. Not for me, but for them, because what they didn't know was that Ernest left behind more than a will. He left behind a condition, a protection. And I, the woman they thought they'd pushed out, was about to become the wall they couldn't climb. So if you've ever been discarded after a lifetime of giving, if you've ever stood in the ruins of a home you built with your bare hands, only to be told you don't belong anymore, stay with me. This is not a story about revenge. This is about remembering who you are when the world tries to forget. And sometimes, the most powerful sentence you'll ever say is silence. I woke up before the sun. The apartment was still and gray, just like my mood. I hadn't unpacked much. Just a nightgown, my toothbrush, and one folder. The same one I had pulled from the fireproof box underneath our bed 2 nights before Ernest passed. Inside it, 38 years of paper, birth certificates, mortgage renewals, power of attorney letters, and the deed. I made myself tea, the last chamomile bag I brought from the old house, and sat still as it steeped. That silence, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. When I stepped out, the morning was cool, a kind of crispness that only comes after a long, hard summer. Portland had just begun to shed its early autumn leaves. And I was shedding something too. Not grief. That would take longer. But delusion, the belief that kindness would always be returned. That family always remembers who held them when they couldn't hold themselves. The bank was only 8 blocks away. The same one Ernest and I had walked into in 1983, newly married and terrified of the $42,000 mortgage we'd just signed. Back then, we were a team. He made the money. I made the money last. Now, I walked into that building alone, but not weak. Colleen, the branch manager, was at her desk. Same neat bob haircut, same pearl earrings. We weren't close friends, but she'd known Ernest. She stood up the second she saw me. "Darlene," she said, her voice lowering as she reached for my hands. "I was so sorry to hear about Ernest. He was a good man." I nodded. "He was. Thank you." She looked me over. I could see it in her eyes, the questions she wasn't sure she was allowed to ask. So I saved her the awkwardness. "I need to talk to someone about my home," I said, holding up the folder. "There are changes happening I wasn't part of." Her expression changed, from sympathy to attention. A woman like Colleen understood what wasn't being said. "Of course," she said quickly. "Come with me." She led me to one of the small glass rooms at the back of the branch, offered coffee. I declined. I needed my mind clear. I laid the folder on the table and opened it slowly, carefully, like I'd practiced. "These," I said, "are the original mortgage papers from 1983, then the refinancing from 1996. And this," I pulled out a folded, notarized envelope. "This is the ownership amendment Ernest filed in 2007, after he had that health scare." Colleen adjusted her glasses, scanning. Her fingers paused on the amendment. "He made you sole primary resident until your death or voluntary departure," she murmured. I nodded. "That's correct. But now, my daughter and her husband are attempting to restructure the mortgage. I believe they're trying to remove me without my consent." Colleen looked up. There was no pity in her eyes now, only a quiet respect. "You've done your homework," she said. I gave a thin smile. "I always have. Ernest handled the big picture. I handled the fine print. For years, I'd signed papers without being told the whole truth. Because I loved. Because I trusted. Because I thought a mother's silence was strength. But now, my silence wasn't about love. It was about knowing exactly what I was doing." Colleen leaned back in her chair. "I can pull up the current refinance application under Perry's name," she said. "If you're listed as a co-owner, he cannot proceed without your signature. If he's tried to file anything without notifying you, that's a legal issue." I nodded once. "They think I won't fight," I said quietly. "Because I'm old. Because I've never raised my voice." Colleen gave me a look only a woman of experience can give. "They forget," she said, that we've been managing lives longer than they've been alive. I smiled again, not from joy, but from recognition of the version of me I'd almost forgotten. We spent the next hour going over files. She printed reports. I asked questions. My hands didn't shake once. As I gathered the folder to leave, Colleen touched my wrist. "Darlene," she said softly, "I don't know what they think you'll do next, but whatever it is, I hope they're ready for it." I paused, met her eyes. "They're not," I said. "But I am." There's a memory that clings to me more tightly than grief. Emily was 6. She stood on a chair in our kitchen, that old maple stool Ernest refinished himself, her small hands covered in flour. She had insisted on baking a real cake, not a box one, because it was my birthday. The kitchen was a mess. Flour in her hair, eggshells on the floor. Vanilla spilled across the counter like melted sunlight. But her eyes, they sparkled with such focused joy, like she was creating magic. And in a way, she was. I remember kneeling beside her, showing her how to crack an egg with one hand. She tried, failed, laughed so loud it echoed off the tiled walls. Ernest walked in just as batter splattered on the cabinet. He didn't yell. He just smiled and said, "Looks like we're eating love for dessert." That kitchen, it was the heart of our home. The same walls that heard lullabies and late-night sobs. The same counter where Emily did homework while I prepped dinner. The same stove where Ernest warmed his hands every winter morning before heading to work. I spent more time in that room than anywhere else in my life. More time than I spent on myself. More time than I spent writing. Because once, before marriage, before motherhood, before the quiet erosion of dreams, I wanted to write children's books, stories about girls who talked to stars, about grandmothers who hid worlds inside teacups. I had 2 short manuscripts, typed on my father's old Royal typewriter. But after Emily was born, I tucked them away, told myself I'd come back to them when things were more stable. When Emily started school, when Ernest got promoted, when we had a little more saved. The whens stacked up like dishes left in the sink. And eventually, I stopped believing I'd ever find the time. But I never resented it, because every bedtime story I told Emily, every note in her lunchbox, every Halloween costume sewn by hand, that was a different kind of writing. A narrative built from care, not paper. Still, there were moments, small flickers, when she would bring home a gold star from school, and I'd wonder what it would feel like to see my name on a cover. But then she'd curl up beside me, ask for another story, and the ache would soften into something gentler. We built a life in that house, a real life, not the kind with perfect furniture and matching curtains, but one stitched together from real things. Burnt toast, laughter in the hallway, socks that never found their pair, Sundays in pajamas till noon. I remember Emily's high school graduation party, the way she looked in that green dress, the one we found on sale but made her glow like she owned the world. I remember Ernest holding my hand and whispering, "You built this, Dar, all of it." And I had. While he went out and faced the world, I built one inside those walls, quietly, steadily, with lists and leftovers and lullabies. I was the scaffolding no one saw, but without me, everything would have collapsed. That's why their words hurt the way they did. Not just because they were cruel, but because they pretended none of that ever happened. That I had simply existed in the background, waiting to be erased. The house was never really yours anyway. That's what Emily said. My daughter, the same child who once whispered, "This kitchen smells like you, Mommy. Can we live here forever?" Now, That same kitchen is being repainted, redesigned, rewritten without me in it. But what they don't understand is the bones of that house are mine, not legally, emotionally, spiritually. It remembers my hands. It holds my stories. My ghost is stitched into the wallpaper. And ghosts don't leave just because someone tells them to pack their things. The last winter we spent together was quieter than the ones before. Ernest had started coughing more often, not the dry, fleeting kind, but the heavy, stubborn ones that seemed to echo through his ribs. He tried to brush it off, said it was just the cold air, but I knew better. His silences became longer, his eyes more distant. One morning, I brought him tea in the old silver cup we'd gotten as a wedding gift. He never liked porcelain, said it felt too fragile, like it belonged in someone else's home. But the silver one, tarnished around the edges, a tiny dent near the handle, that was his favorite. Solid, worn, ours. He sat by the window watching the branches sway. Emily had visited the weekend before, bringing along Carter and their dog. She'd barely stayed for an hour. Too busy. Always in a rush. She didn't even notice the wheezing in his chest. I handed him the tea. He took it with both hands, slower than usual. And then he looked at me. Not just glanced. Looked. The way someone does when they're memorizing, as if this moment needed to be carved into stone. "You know," he said quietly, "this house never stood because of me." I laughed softly. "That's nonsense, Ernie. You fixed the roof twice with your bare hands." He smiled, but then he reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. It was tied with a red string. His fingers trembled as he placed it in my hands. "What's this?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just leaned back, eyes still on mine. "I took care of something, just in case. I never told Emily, never told anyone." My heart skipped. "I added your name back onto the deed, quietly. After that thing with the refinance. You remember?" I nodded, tears already welling. "She didn't want your name on it back then. Said it complicated things for taxes." "She said a lot of things," I murmured. He exhaled slowly. "Dar, I don't know what'll happen when I'm gone. But I do know one thing." "What's that?" "This house. It's yours. Always has been. Not just because your name is back on paper, but because without you, it would have never been a home." Then he placed his hand gently over mine. She doesn't see it yet. Maybe she never will. But I need you to remember it for both of us." That was Ernest. Never one for grand speeches. But when he spoke like that, it pierced straight through me. Later that night, we pulled out our wedding album. The cover was frayed, the binding cracked. But the photos still smiled back at us. Young, foolish versions of ourselves in ill-fitting formal wear. I wore a veil my aunt had stitched by hand. He wore a boutonniere he picked from our neighbor's garden that morning. We drank tea in silence, letting the pictures do the talking. He stopped on one of us laughing. Someone must have told a terrible joke. He touched it softly. "Em was conceived 3 weeks after this," he whispered. I chuckled. "Well, that explains the midnight cravings." He laughed, but it turned into a cough, then a grimace. His strength was fading, but that night, he was all mine again. 3 weeks later, he was gone. Peacefully, in that same chair, with the silver teacup still on the table, and the envelope, untouched, still tied with red string. I buried him with a single photo from our wedding album, the one where I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me like I hung the moon. That envelope is still with me. Unopened by Emily, ignored by Carter. But it doesn't matter. Because what Ernest gave me that night wasn't just a document. It was a reminder of who I was, of what I built. And as I held the teacup the morning after the dinner, the one where they told me to leave, I smiled. Because I already knew something they didn't. I sat at the kitchen table, same one Ernest and I had shared countless meals over, with a stack of documents spread out like autumn leaves. The morning light hit the edge of the table just right, dust motes floating in that quiet, indifferent way. And in that silence, I felt the kind of ache that didn't make a sound. The bank had printed everything for me. Years of transactions, scanned copies of authorizations, all with my signature at the bottom. My name was there, in blue ink, again and again. But I couldn't remember signing any of them. There was one in particular, dated back to 2015. It gave Emily, my only daughter, durable power of attorney. I blinked. No, that couldn't be right. I would have remembered something like that. I turned to the second page. There it was, a line that read, "This authorization includes full authority over property titles, financial decisions, and real estate transfer on behalf of Darlene Whitmore." My chest tightened. I remembered that day now, vaguely. I was recovering from gallbladder surgery. Emily had brought soup and a clipboard. She said something about consolidating paperwork to help manage the insurance claims. "You don't need to read all this, Mom. Just a few signatures, so I can help deal with the headache," she had said. She kissed my forehead. I was groggy from the meds. I trusted her. I didn't even lift my glasses. I had signed. Back then, it had felt like love. Now it felt like betrayal with a legal stamp. I flipped through more pages. There were documents tied to the house. Notarized transfer intentions, refinancing terms I'd never read, paper trails that looped in and out of Emily and Carter's names. One file even detailed the rental agreement of the guest house out back, the one I used to read in when Emily was little. I didn't know it had been leased out last year. I ran my hand along the edge of the paper. So smooth, so official, so cold. My name had been used over and over, not as a person, but as a placeholder, as a gateway to something they wanted, and I hadn't even known I was handing it over. A part of me wanted to call Emily right then, scream, demand answers. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew the answers already. She had done what she thought she could, what she thought I wouldn't notice, because I trusted her enough not to look. And maybe that was the worst part. It wasn't just the signatures. It was the blind faith. I closed the folder gently. Then I walked into the living room, pulled down the old sewing box from the top shelf. Inside, tucked between thread and needles, was the last real letter Emily had ever written me, from her college dorm. "Love you forever, Mama." It ended. That ink had long since faded. I held that letter in one hand, the legal papers in the other, and I whispered into the empty room, "I signed because I loved you, not because I agreed." The man at the bank had kind eyes, but his fingers moved like clockwork. Efficient. He clicked through documents, murmuring under his breath. I sat still, pretending to understand every screen, every term, until he stopped. "Oh," he said. "Looks like there's already a refinancing application pending. Same property. Under Perry Whitmore." My breath caught. "Excuse me?" I asked. Calm. Almost too calm. He turned the screen toward me. "See here? Application submitted last week. It's still in preliminary status because there's a joint ownership notation attached to the deed." He scrolled further. "There's a pending request to remove the secondary party. That's you, once signatures are complete. I leaned forward. They're refinancing the house? He gave a polite smile. It's not unusual, especially with property values rising in this area. But because your name is still technically on the original title, your authorization is still required. Still required. For now. I stared at the screen. There it was. My name, next to Perry's. He had applied to refinance the house less than a week after Ernest's funeral. He was ready. He was expecting me to vanish. He had already lined up the next phase. No mourning. No space for grief. Just financial strategy. I swallowed hard. Do you need a printed copy of the application? The banker asked gently. I nodded. He printed it out, staple by staple. Each page a slap to my ribs. As I read it on the bench outside the bank, I could see it all. His plans, loan amount higher than before, stated renovations, estimated return on investment. There was a column that read, primary occupant, Perry Whitmore and family. Another column that read, current occupant to vacate pending final signature. Current occupant. That was me. I wasn't a mother-in-law. I wasn't even a person. I was a line item. A box to be unchecked. I sat with that thought for a while. The wind picked up. A woman across the street walked her golden retriever, laughing into her phone. It could have been me, in another life. When I came home, the door was locked, not bolted, just locked. Something about that small detail felt heavier than it should have. Inside, the kitchen was too clean. No sign of breakfast dishes or the coffee cup I always left beside the kettle. The air smelled like bleach. I walked upstairs to the guest room, my room now, and sat on the bed. I held the refinancing packet in one hand and the old wedding album of Ernest and me in the other. In the first photo, we were smiling in front of the same porch Perry now wanted to renovate into a home office. I touched Ernest's face with the tip of my finger. You said this house would always be mine, I whispered, but even that promise had faded with the ink. Downstairs, I heard Perry's voice, brisk, on the phone. Yeah, we'll have her out before the next quarter. It's just paperwork at this point. That was all I needed. Not rage, not confrontation, just confirmation. He wasn't confused. He wasn't reacting out of grief. He had planned this. And I was done being the woman who ignored the signs. I almost didn't recognize her at first. Colleen had cut her hair short, wore small reading glasses now, and moved with the careful grace of someone who spent decades behind a desk, listening more than she spoke. But when she looked up from her screen, something sparked in her eyes. Darlene, she said softly, like it was a name from a different lifetime. I nodded. It's been a while. Colleen stood, came around the desk, and pulled me into a gentle hug. The kind you only offer when you remember someone. Not just their face, but their kindness. I think the last time I saw you, she said, stepping back with a smile, was when Ernest opened that second account for your writing fund. My chest tightened. He surprised me with it. Told me someday I'd get back to the novel. Colleen chuckled. He was always one for quiet gestures, never flashy, but he adored you. We sat. The office smelled like lemon polish and old files, comforting in its own way. I need your help, I said after a beat. I need to understand what I signed, what's real, and what's just Perry's idea of convenience. Colleen didn't flinch. She nodded, clicked, typed. Let's pull the file. She read silently for a moment, then turned the screen so I could see. Your name is still on the deed, Darlene. The original joint ownership from 1985 hasn't been fully severed. But I signed something years ago. Emily brought it to me. I assumed it was a management document, something about taxes. Colleen tapped the screen. That was a limited power of attorney. It allowed her to make inquiries, not transfer rights, and it expired 5 years ago. I stared. So, this house, it's still yours, Colleen said gently. No sale, no refinance can move forward without your explicit, notarized signature. My throat caught. She leaned forward, lowered her voice. Perry's not the first man I've seen try this. But you're not the kind of woman who forgets the details, are you? I met her eyes. No, I whispered. Not anymore. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Colleen smiled again, that familiar kindness from another era. You were the first person to bring homemade cinnamon rolls to the staff every December. Even when Ernest was laid off in '91, you still showed up with a tin and said, kindness isn't seasonal. I never forgot that. That moment cracked something open inside me. Not because it was about cinnamon rolls, but because someone remembered me for who I truly was. Not the in-law, not the old widow, but Darlene, a woman who once dreamed of stories, who once mattered. Colleen stood, opened a drawer, and slid a folder across the desk. This is a printout of everything tied to your name. You'll want to keep it somewhere safe. I held the folder, felt the weight of it. The weight of my name, still legally there, still standing. Before I left, Colleen added, Perry may assume you don't know your rights. Let him keep assuming. Just don't forget that you have more than you think. I left the bank with my heels clicking against the tile floor, not hurried, but steady. Outside, the wind had shifted, slightly cooler, like something had recalibrated. They hadn't counted on memory, on quiet history, on someone like Colleen. But most of all, they hadn't counted on me still knowing who I was, and having the papers to prove it. When Ernest and I first got married, he brought home the check, but I balanced the books. For 38 years, I was the one who tracked every grocery receipt, car repair, and property tax payment. I knew the cadence of our finances better than I knew my own breathing. Not because I didn't trust him, but because that was how I loved, by noticing everything. So after my meeting with Colleen, I went home, turned off my phone, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey, no sugar, just a thin curl of lemon, and started printing every transaction tied to the house. It took a while, but once the pages were stacked in front of me, line after line of cold, silent ink, I felt the shift. There, a transfer dated 2 years ago, a private lender, $140,000, secured against the equity of the house. I blinked. Not a traditional bank loan, not through Colleen's branch. A bridge loan, high interest, almost desperate. And the name on the paperwork? Perry Whitlock, borrower, with a co-authorization line. Blank. My stomach twisted. He'd leveraged the house behind our backs, behind Emily's too, if she hadn't been part of it. It explained the pressure, the sudden push to clear the house after Ernest passed, the veiled urgency in Perry's voice, the dinner, the sentence I'd never forget. Now that your husband is dead, mourn, pack your bags, and never come back. No one says that unless something else is burning behind their eyes. I took a highlighter, traced the transaction dates, checked the timeline. 3 months before Ernest passed. Right around the time Perry had offered to help file the taxes. I hadn't thought twice. I was caring for a man in hospice. My world had shrunk to hours, and morphine drips and warm claws against a cold forehead. And Perry had been available, helpful, too helpful. Now it made sense. The loan wasn't just greedy, it was timed, coordinated. Because if Ernest had died and I had followed quietly, Perry would have held every key. But I hadn't followed. I had sat. I had remembered. I had read every line. Because here's what no one realized. I still have the habit of watching the pennies. I made a note in the margin. Loan balance exceeds equity threshold if refinanced, meaning if Perry tried to sell, the lender would come first. He'd walk away with debt, not profit, unless he could offload the risk, unless I signed, unless I disappeared. I took a breath, steady, the kind you take before turning off the stove after a long simmer. No one knew I'd kept the old financial ledger, the one Ernest and I filled together. No one knew I still used the same budgeting system I made by hand in 1989. I knew the flow of this house better than its pipes, and I knew something else too. Perry was not in control. Not anymore. I gathered the pages, paper-clipped the timeline, slid them into a folder, labeled, "What I Know." Then I stood up, poured the rest of my tea down the sink, and smiled, just faintly, at the reflection in the window. Not because I was happy, but because I wasn't afraid. They thought my silence meant surrender. They forgot. Some of us were raised to balance both the books and the storms, without raising our voices. I was wiping the kitchen counter when I saw her from the window. She walked a little slower now, cane tapping gently against the sidewalk, but her posture proud as ever. Irene Chamberlain, our neighbor for over 4 decades, the only one left on the block who knew my name before I became just Emily's mom. I opened the door before she had a chance to knock. "Well, if it isn't the best banana bread baker in Northern California." She smiled, her eyes misted with warmth, and something more. Recognition. She stepped in, looked around, and said softly, "Still smells like lemon oil and library books in here, just like always." I poured us tea, the good kind, loose leaves steeped in the silver teapot Ernest gave me our second Christmas together. It clicked on the saucer just right. A quiet sound, familiar. We talked for a while, or rather, Irene did. She filled the space with memories. About the garden Ernest used to tend. About Emily riding her pink tricycle down the hill. Scraped knees and wild hair. About the time I stayed up 3 nights sewing her prom dress from old curtains because we couldn't afford new fabric. Then she paused. "Do you remember the block party? Summer of 2009? I nodded. The one where Emily had just returned from college. Confident. Distant. Irene's eyes held mine. That was the first time I heard her say it. Just a whisper, but I never forgot. She turned to Perry and said, her voice broke slightly, "Mom's becoming such a burden." I froze, not because I hadn't suspected it, but because hearing it confirmed, I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the slow withdrawal. The way Emily began speaking to me like I was inconvenient background noise, like a task to manage, a file to close. Irene reached into her purse and pulled out something wrapped in soft linen. "I found this last week while packing up my tea cabinet. It belongs here more than it ever did with me." She placed it gently in front of me. It was the matching silver teacup. From the set Ernest had gifted me, only one had survived the earthquake in '89. Or so I thought. I looked at Irene, stunned. "You lent me this one when yours broke," she smiled. Said it didn't matter if they didn't match. It was the conversation that counted. I stared at the cup. faint scratches along the rim, slight bend on the handle, flawed, but still whole, like me. I held it in both hands, the weight surprisingly comforting. My fingers trembled, not from age, but from remembering. Irene reached out, touched my wrist. You've always carried so much, quietly. But you were never invisible, Darlene. Not to the ones who paid attention. I didn't cry. I just let the silence do what words couldn't. Because for the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as someone's responsibility, not as someone's past, but as someone who had mattered, to a neighbor, to a woman who remembered, to herself. And when Irene left that afternoon, Kane tapping gently once again, I stood at the door a little longer. Holding the silver cup. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even symmetrical anymore. But it was proof. That memory, like metal, may tarnish, but it does not lie. And some love, though quiet, outlasts betrayal. I didn't answer the first call that morning, or the second, or the third. Each missed call felt like a stone dropping into a still lake, but I refused to ripple. Perry's name kept flashing on my screen. Then came the messages. One read, Darlene, we need your signature. Urgent. Please call me. Another, they're stalling the refinance. This could blow up everything. I simply turned the phone over, face down, quiet. Silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, and I wore it like armor. At 8:12 a.m., a new notification lit up. Emily. Mom, what's going on? Perry said the bank can't move forward unless you sign. Why are you doing this? That part stung. Why are you doing this? As if I were the one who had rewritten the deed. As if I had orchestrated my own removal from the only home I'd ever built. I set the phone aside again. I didn't reply. Didn't argue. Didn't explain. Because they weren't looking for truth. They were looking for compliance, and I was done offering it. By noon, Perry had called 8 times. By 2, Emily was at my door. She didn't text. She didn't call ahead. Just showed up. Tight smile, trembling hands, anxiety radiating off her like heat. I invited her in. She didn't comment on the space, small, furnished, and rented by the week. No family photos, no floral wallpaper, no creaky floorboard Ernest used to fix every winter. Just me. And 2 teacups. The silver set, the one I kept packed away for good company. I poured tea without speaking. She barely touched hers. Mom, I think we need to talk. I nodded. She hesitated, then blurted out, Why are you holding up the refinance? Perry said you're refusing to sign. That's not like you. I looked at her, really looked at her. Grown now, in many ways, a stranger, but still my daughter. I said nothing. She fidgeted. We were going to use the equity for the pool extension and the nursery. It's not just for us, Mom. It's for the family. Family. That word again, used like a shield, thrown like a spear. Still, I said nothing. Are you upset about the dinner? Because I know it didn't come out the way it should have. Still silence. Perry thought, we thought it would be best if you had space. You were grieving. It wasn't personal. Not personal. Being told to mourn, pack, and disappear wasn't personal. I took a sip of tea, held her gaze, didn't flinch. Her voice cracked. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder? I smiled gently, not sarcastically. Just, finally. And I placed my teacup down with a quiet clink. That sound lingered longer than her words. Emily stood, her face pale. I don't know what you're doing, but I hope you think it through. For everyone's sake. She left without hugging me, and I sat there, still, centered, utterly calm. I wasn't doing anything, That was the point. For 38 years, I gave and gave and gave. Documents, deeds, time, trust. Now, I withheld. Not out of malice, but because withholding was the only truth I had left. The refinance wouldn't go through without me. The panic in Perry's voice proved that. But I wasn't panicking. They thought silence was a pause. They hadn't learned yet. For some of us, silence is the answer. The knock on my door came just before dusk. Soft, hesitant, but I knew it was her. I opened it to find Emily, red-eyed, trembling, clutching a manila folder like it was her lifeline. She didn't speak at first, just stood there on the threshold, as if the right words had slipped through her fingers on the way here. "Come in," I said gently. She walked in, sat down on the worn gray couch. The same one I'd found at the secondhand store 3 weeks ago. I'd told myself it was temporary, but now, I wasn't so sure. She didn't even wait for tea this time. "Mom?" she began, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry for the way everything went down. I really am." I nodded, letting her have space. "It's just, Perry doesn't always think things through, and I was trying to be a good wife, a good mom, a good daughter." She exhaled hard, then added, "But I messed up. I know that." I waited. Her eyes welled up. "I need your help. Just this once, please." She handed me the folder. Inside were the same refinancing documents, same blanks, same desperation, same pressure. "I'm not asking for much," she whispered. "If we don't get this approved, the bank's pulling everything. We'll lose the house. The kids will be uprooted. I'll have to move back in with Perry's parents. It'll ruin us." I traced the edge of the folder with one finger. "I just need your signature," she said. "One line, one page, that's all." I looked up, right into the eyes of the girl I once taught to tie her shoes and brush her teeth and write her name in crayon on the back of cereal boxes. And I asked her softly, "Emily, do you need me? Or do you need the assets I still legally hold?" Her face twisted slightly, as if the words cut deeper than she expected. "Of course I need you," she snapped, then caught herself. "I mean, I'm your daughter." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm asking." She blinked, confused, because needing someone means loving them for who they are, not for what they own, not for what they can sign away for your comfort. And right now, I'm trying to understand which one it is. Silence. Then her shoulders slumped. Tears spilled, raw and real. "Mom, I'm scared," she whispered. "I didn't know Perry was pushing the loan that far. I thought it was under control. I didn't mean to. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted our life to keep going. I thought you'd always be there, always say yes. You always did." She wasn't wrong. For 30-something years, I had always said yes. To babysitting, to wiring money, to Sunday dinners even when I was too tired to drive, to taking their side even when Ernest warned me not to. "I know," I said. "I was always there. But maybe that's why you thought I'd never leave." She covered her face, ashamed. "I'm not punishing you, Emily," I continued, softer now. "I'm protecting myself. Something I should have learned how to do a long time ago." She looked at me. Really looked this time. Like she wasn't sure who I was anymore. Maybe that was a good thing. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "But I need you to understand something." I handed the folder back, untouched, unsigned. "I'm not angry. I'm just awake." Her lips parted, but no words came. And in that moment, I felt something shift. Not in her, in me. I wasn't shutting the door. I was simply refusing to open it on command. Emily stood, wiped her eyes. Will you think about it? She asked, one last time. I already have, I said, and for once, I'm thinking about myself. She left quietly. No slamming, no screaming. Just quiet footsteps down the hallway. The kind that echo when you know something's changed forever. The next morning, the phone rang again. Just once this time. I let it go to voicemail. But by noon, there was a knock on my door. Again. Emily. She looked less frantic than the day before, more composed, but her eyes still carried the same pleading weight. I invited her in. No questions, no tea, just space. She sat down, folder in her lap again, this time unopened. Mom, she began, I've been thinking. About what you said. I nodded. All right. I want to fix this, she said quickly. I want to make it right. I leaned in a little. Then let's talk about what right looks like. She blinked. You mean the papers? No, I said gently. Not yet. I mean us. What making things right means between a mother and daughter. She fidgeted, uncertain. I'm listening, she finally said. So I told her, plain and calm. I'm not asking for much. Not a show, not flowers, not money. I paused. I'm asking for 3 things. She looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. First, I said, respect. Not just in tone, but in action. Don't talk to me about love if you won't let me stay in my own home after burying my husband. Her lips tightened. Second, an apology. Not for paperwork, but for treating me like I was disposable. That night at the dinner table, you didn't flinch. You nodded. She swallowed hard. And third, I continued, accountability. Don't ask me to help fix what was broken unless you're willing to admit who broke it. Emily looked down. Her fingers gripped the edge of the folder. I'm not blaming you for everything, I added, but I won't pretend it was nothing. I don't know what to say, she murmured. You don't have to say anything today, I replied. But if you want my signature, if you want me, it begins with truth. Yours. She didn't speak. The silence stretched, not awkward, just honest. Finally, she said, I don't think I can promise all of that. Not now. I'm still sorting through it. I nodded. That's fair, I said. I've had weeks. You've had days. She looked hopeful again. So, maybe you'll sign later? I smiled, gently. Emily, I didn't refuse because I'm angry. I refused because I finally see. She tilted her head. For years, I signed things without reading. Said yes without thinking. I thought love was endless giving. But now I realize giving without boundaries isn't love. It's self-erasure. Emily's eyes welled again. I'm not punishing you, I repeated. I'm protecting what's left of me and your father's memory. She looked away, stared at the silver teacup on the shelf, the one Irene returned, the one she remembered from childhood but hadn't touched in years. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. I don't want to be someone you only remember after you've lost everything, I said. A long pause. She stood, picked up the folder slowly. I understand, she said, even if I don't fully get it yet. That's enough for now, I said. As she reached the door, I added quietly, when you're ready to come back without a pen in your hand, my door stays open. She didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders drop just a little. Relieved, ashamed, human. She left. And I stood in the quiet again, but this time, it wasn't emptiness. It was space I'd finally cleared for myself. It happened faster than I expected. 3 days after Emily's visit, I got a call from the bank, not to ask, but to inform. Perry's refinancing application had been officially suspended. The loan was frozen pending irregular authorization status. They didn't need my signature. They needed my absence from it. I thanked the voice on the other end politely, then set the phone down. The silence in the room hummed differently. It wasn't lonely. It was charged. That same afternoon, Perry showed up to their own bank, breathing fire. He argued. He blamed. He even tried bringing in a third-party broker, but policy was policy. No co-signature. No restructure. The banker had told him, according to the manager I later spoke with. Perry couldn't grasp it. He'd always operated on assumed power, entitlement. He saw women like me, older, grieving, quiet, as background characters. But this time, the background had become the blueprint. Emily, I later heard, didn't go with him. She stayed home. And I imagine the silence in their kitchen began to speak louder than any argument. She didn't call me that day, or the next. But on the fourth day, a letter came. Not typed. Handwritten. From her. She wrote about little things. How the twins had started school. How she missed her late father's humming in the hallway. And then, just one sentence near the middle. I made lemon bars yesterday. They didn't taste the same. I don't know why, but I kept hearing you laughing when I spilled the sugar. I closed my eyes. Lemon bars. Our Saturday tradition when she was 8. She used to sneak extra powdered sugar when she thought I wasn't looking. She thought that laughter was amusement. It was, in part. But mostly, it was love. Love for the way she existed so freely in my kitchen, in my world, in my heart. When Ernest was still alive, he used to say, "You're the reason this house breathes, Darlene." Back then, I thought he meant my routines. The meals, the cleaned sheets, the lights left on in the hall for midnight wanderers. But now I know he meant my presence. And that presence, once overlooked, was beginning to echo in the spaces they tried to erase me from. I heard Perry was scrambling, trying to find another guarantor, attempting to sell one of his work trucks to plug short-term losses. Desperation has a scent. Even through distance, you can smell it. And yet, I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching someone fall, but there was peace in knowing I didn't have to fall with them. Emily's second letter came a day later. She didn't mention the house, didn't ask about signatures, didn't mention Perry. She simply wrote, "Do you still have the silver teacup?" I remember Dad polishing it every December. I ran my hand along the shelf. Yes, it was still there. Returned by Irene. Resting quietly, like it had never been taken. And somehow, I knew, Emily was beginning to understand. Not just about the house, but about home. Home wasn't a place you inherited. It was a place you protected. And somewhere deep inside, I believe she started to feel, really feel, how much I had once done that for her. Not through lectures, but through lemon bars, through bedtime songs, through saying yes far too often, and now, finally, through a single, sacred number. They called me again. This time, it was Emily's voice, but Perry's silence in the background was unmistakable. "Mom, can we meet? Just to talk?" I said yes. They came to the community library near my neighborhood. Neutral ground. I wore my late husband's favorite scarf, navy blue with a little gold pin I'd sewn into the hem myself. They were already there when I arrived. Perry stood, but barely looked me in the eye. We sat in a small, glass-walled meeting room. Quiet. Sunlight danced across the table. Emily began, hesitantly. "We understand the house can't be refinanced without your consent. That's clear now." I nodded. Perry leaned forward, trying to mask his urgency. "We're willing to make some concessions. maybe restructure things. You'd be protected. Protected? I let the word hang in the air like a feather refusing to fall. I'm not asking for protection, I said calmly. I'm asking for recognition. Emily winced slightly. I've thought about this carefully, I continued, and I am willing to sign, conditionally. Perry's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Emily asked, "What conditions?" I pulled out a single folded sheet of paper from my purse. 3 clauses. That's all. I handed it over. Clause 1. The house shall remain under joint ownership between Emily and myself, unless mutually dissolved, in writing. Clause 2. No financial instrument shall be placed against the property without dual consent. Clause 3. I retain full residential rights for the remainder of my natural life. Perry read the lines quickly, then looked up sharply. This is overkill. I met his gaze. No, Perry. This is adulthood. You asked for help. I'm giving it, with the respect that should have always been there. He opened his mouth, probably to challenge it. But Emily touched his arm. Let me, she said quietly. Then, to me, and emotionally, what do you need from us? I looked at her for a long second. That question I hadn't expected. I took a breath. I need my daughter back. Not the polite, scheduled version. The real one. The girl who used to sneak cookies after bedtime and tell me everything. I don't need her to be perfect. Just honest. Just present. Emily's eyes welled up. She nodded. And him? I asked, gently motioning toward Perry. I can't speak for him, she whispered. But I will stand beside what's fair. Perry scoffed under his breath. This is about power. No, I said, still calm. This is about healing. And healing requires boundaries. That's what these are. He stood suddenly as if to leave, but Emily didn't move. Instead, she reached for a pen. I'll sign it, she said, steady. I took the pen next, signed beneath her name, then slid it across the table to Perry. His hands hovered, then withdrew. I'll have my lawyer look it over, he muttered. That's your right, I replied. But the terms won't change. He gave me a long, narrow stare. Not hate, just confusion, like a man who just realized the river had changed direction while he was still building the dam. Emily looked at me, eyes full of something I hadn't seen in her in years. Gratitude and a little awe. I didn't set those conditions to punish you, I said as I stood. I set them because I finally remembered who I am and what I deserve. And if I don't teach you that now, who will? I left the room slowly, not triumphant, just whole. And for the first time in decades, my boundaries didn't feel like walls. They felt like windows, finally letting the light back in. The leaves had turned by the time I returned. The house looked the same from the outside. Same pale blue shutters. Same wind chimes I had hung years ago, still rattling softly in the breeze. But everything else, everything unseen, had changed. I parked across the street, no drama, no suitcase, no folder, just me, a warm coat, and a quiet purpose. They knew I was coming. I had sent a single-line text. I'll be stopping by at noon. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. No reply, but I didn't need one. When I walked up the path, the front door was unlocked. Not in welcome, just unlocked. Perry was in the living room, leaning on the edge of the fireplace, arms crossed. But he didn't say a word. Emily was seated near the window, eyes red, shoulders trembling slightly. Still, I said nothing. I walked through the hallway, my fingers trailing the familiar trim on the walls. Every step was memory. The hallway, where I once taped up their spelling test stars. The stairs I once carried Emily up after she fell asleep in the car. I took each step now as if walking through sacred ground. At the top of the stairs, I turned left into what used to be my bedroom. It was different now. New paint, new curtains. But on the shelf above the dresser, it was still there. The silver teacup. Polished. Untouched. I held it gently in both hands, as if it could still warm itself. Beside it, tucked between two meaningless books, was the wedding album. Ours, mine and Ernest's. The cover was worn at the corners, the satin ribbon still looped around the spine. I took that too, and then I stood still for a moment. I let the silence settle. I thought I might cry, but instead, I exhaled and felt light. When I turned to leave, Emily was standing at the foot of the stairs. She didn't block my path. She just said, voice trembling, "Mom, you still remember everything, don't you?" I nodded. I remember enough to know what I gave, and what I will no longer give away. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I was afraid you'd come to take the house back. I shook my head softly. I didn't come for the house, Emily. I came for what was always mine. The teacup, the memories, and myself. Perry hadn't moved. He stayed in the living room, frozen in pride or maybe in disbelief. I walked past him without pause. At the door, Emily asked one last question. Will we ever be okay again? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened the door, let in a gust of autumn wind. Then I looked back at her. That's up to you. And with that, I stepped outside. Not bitter, not triumphant, just finished and free. The kettle whistles softly. It's not the same model we used to have at the house. This one is smaller, stainless steel. It sings instead of shrieks. I pour the hot water into a wide porcelain cup, not the kind you'd find in a store anymore. This one has history, weight, and a small chip at the rim. The silver teacup. My silver teacup. It's sitting right here on my windowsill. My apartment is modest. One bedroom, wooden floors, a balcony that faces the city's skyline. But the peace here, it's loud in the most beautiful way. I sit by the window. The wind rustles a nearby tree. Leaves fall and rise again like they're unsure if they want to go. I wrap both hands around the warm cup. Breathe in. Earl Grey. With a touch of honey, Ernest's favorite. Mine now. On the table in front of me is an open notebook. I've started writing again. Nothing grand, just thoughts, memories, truths I used to swallow. Now I let them land gently on paper. Even if no one reads them, I read them. I tell my story to myself, and that's enough. Across the room, an old radio hums a melody from the 60s. I used to dance to that song in the kitchen when Emily was small. She'd giggle and call me silly. I didn't mind. I loved being her safe place. I think of her now. I don't hate her. I don't even feel anger anymore. Just distance. The kind of distance that's necessary, like pruning a rose bush, not to destroy, but to let things breathe. Perry? I won't speak on him. Some people grow. Some don't. That's not my burden to carry. I'm not sure what will come next. Maybe Emily will call again. Maybe she won't. Maybe she'll try to rebuild. Maybe she won't know how. That's okay, because I've already rebuilt. Not a house, not a marriage, not even a family, but myself. I drink slowly, watch the clouds drift, and in this stillness, something crystallizes. I never needed the house to feel at home. I only needed a place where I could pour tea and not be afraid someone might steal the cup. And now, I have that. So I ask you, listening to me now, if this were your story, would you have forgiven them? Would you have signed the paper, gone back, or walked away like I did, not out of spite, but from a place of knowing you are worth more than silence and survival? Leave a comment. Let me know what you would have done. Let's talk. Let's listen. Let's heal. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from going back. It comes from sitting still, pouring tea, and remembering that you were always enough. I take one last sip, look down at my notebook, and write the final line of today's entry. I didn't lose the house. I found the room where I belong.